Imagine a human stepping into the heart of an empire, a world where tradition clashes with dazzling technology, and a single misstep could unravel everything. But who would have thought that the moment a queen pointed at him, he would become the center of the empire, and the focus of everyone's astonished gaze? The man stumbled into the palace as if fate itself had tripped him, his shoes catching on nothing visible, sending him sprawling across the polished, translucent floor. It shimmered like liquid glass under his weight, bending light into 100 impossible angles, and for a second, he wondered if he'd landed in some hallucinatory dream. Hovering spheres of soft violet light drifted above him, casting gentle shadows that moved independently, as though the palace itself had a sense of humor. When he finally sat up, brushing his sleeve against the smooth surface, he noticed that nothing was quite normal. The walls pulsed faintly, showing images that seemed alive, glimpses of alien landscapes, histories, and creatures that didn't belong in any human textbook. He straightened, heart thumping, and tried to act as if this was exactly where he belonged, though he was very sure it was not. A series of hovering trays drifted past, carrying glasses filled with liquids that shimmered and changed color like tiny galaxies trapped in crystal. One tray, seemingly sensing his presence, veered dangerously close, threatening to drench him in a bright, syrupy substance. He flailed his arms, managing a heroic save, or at least he thought it heroic, though the liquid spilled anyway, landing in a perfect arc across the floor. The tray wobbled, the hovering mechanism whirring and squealing like an upset insect. He froze, imagining the embarrassment of being remembered as the human who drowned in alien nectar on his first day. Then a melodic, perfectly modulated laugh rang through the chamber, and the man looked up to see her. She was more radiant than anything he could have imagined, a vision of elegance that seemed almost impossible to put into words. Her skin glimmered with a soft, warm hue, her silver hair falling in waves that caught the drifting lights above. Those elven-style ears framed her face, hinting at an otherworldly lineage, and yet her eyes, sharp, intelligent, and warm, held a playful curiosity that made the man feel seen, as if all the oddities of the palace were suddenly secondary to her gaze. Beside her, a younger figure, the princess perhaps, peeked from behind a pillar, her expression a mixture of suspicion and amusement, her lips twitching as though she were suppressing a giggle at his floundering entrance. The man's instinctive reaction was to bow, though in the gravity-shifting chamber, the attempt turned into an awkward, slow-motion tumble that ended with him grasping at nothing and landing on his knees. He muttered a hasty, "Sorry. I'm fine," hoping that his voice didn't betray the panic he felt. The queen's laughter tinkled again, light but commanding, carrying with it a subtle warmth that loosened some of the tension knotted in his chest. The princess's giggle slipped out, soft and genuine, and the man's embarrassment deepened. He had been caught entirely by the alien's version of amusement, a subtle yet potent reminder that humor here carried its own etiquette, unspoken and alien. "Careful, traveler," the queen said, stepping closer, her presence both grounding and overwhelming. She gestured elegantly, her hands tracing arcs in the air that seemed to leave faint trails of light. "This palace does not suffer clumsiness lightly." The man managed a sheepish smile. "I guess I'm not very coordinated," he admitted. A small robotic servant drifted forward, attempting to offer him a towel, but miscalculated the trajectory and spun the cloth into a perfect knot around one of the hovering lights. It twirled comically, casting chaotic reflections across the floor, and for a moment, even the queen's composure wavered as a small smile crept onto her face. The man's eyes followed the young princess, who had now stepped fully into view. Her red-tinged skin glowed faintly under the shifting lights, her expression teasing but watchful. She was old enough to carry herself with poise, yet young enough for amusement to ripple through her gestures with playful unpredictability. She tilted her head at him, arching a brow, and whispered something he couldn't hear, but her lips curved in a way that made him suspect she had just mocked his entrance. He flushed, unsure whether he should laugh or hide under one of the hovering projection panels, which displayed the image of a long-dead general frozen mid-battle. The queen's gaze returned to him, steady now, examining him as if she could see the sum total of his character with a glance. "You are unusual," she said, and the man blinked, uncertain whether that was praise or an understatement of cosmic proportions. "Unusual is not unwelcome," she added, a note of humor threading her voice like a golden filament. He nodded eagerly, hoping he'd interpreted it correctly. "Good, then we are off to a promising start," she continued, gesturing toward the grand doors that led deeper into the palace. "Come. There is much to see, and I suspect you are quite capable of causing further spectacle." He followed, each step revealing more of the palace's impossible wonders. Gravity shifted gently, nudging him sideways at intervals that made walking a cautious game. The walls displayed histories of alien rulers and battles, shimmering and alive, their scenes occasionally looping in playful absurdity. A general tripping over his own feet in one, a courtier's wig floating upward in another. The man could hardly keep a straight face, caught between awe, panic, and the absurdity of it all. By the time they reached a landing where the chamber stretched upward into what seemed like infinity, he realized he was beginning to feel at home in this surreal world, not because he belonged, but because humor, curiosity, and unexpected kindness bridged the gulf between human and alien. The princess's eyes followed him steadily, no longer fully amused but intrigued, and the queen's smile lingered like a promise that even the strangest human might have a place here. For a fleeting moment, amid gravity's subtle rebellion, hovering lights and walls that pulsed with living memory, he dared to imagine that perhaps, just perhaps, he might survive the palace and even enjoy it. The next step, he suspected, would be far more perilous, but for now, he allowed himself a small, cautious grin. Even in a court of aliens who could likely read his thoughts before he had them, a little humor was universal. And if he was going to be clumsy, awkward, and entirely human, he might as well do it spectacularly. The chamber into which he was ushered seemed to have a life of its own, though it was impossible to tell whether it was amusement or malice guiding its behavior. The floor rippled beneath his boots, not in waves, exactly, but in subtle undulations that forced him to walk like a man crossing a trampoline while wearing tight dress shoes. Holographic projections flickered along the walls, depicting grand vistas of alien cities, towers that twisted like corkscrews, bridges floating unsupported in midair, and citizens with glimmering robes performing tasks that defied physics. One projection showed a marketplace where vendors levitated their wares, tossing them back and forth with zero effort, until one item, a glowing fruit shaped like a crescent moon, zoomed straight at him. He ducked instinctively, earning a barely suppressed chuckle from a hovering observer who looked like a hybrid of a humanoid and a floating jellyfish. "Careful," a voice said behind him. He turned to see a young woman, her skin flushed with a warm reddish hue that seemed almost to glow under the shifting lights. Her hair fell like liquid silver down her back, catching every glimmer from the hovering spheres above. She had elven-style ears that peeked from beneath her hair, and her eyes sparkled with mischief. "That one doesn't bite," she added with a wink, pointing to the fruit now spinning lazily in the air above him. He swallowed, trying not to look foolish, and somehow managed to bow just enough to avoid tripping on the unpredictable floor. A sudden hiss of pneumatic air announced the arrival of the next spectacle. A robotic servant designed, perhaps, to test human reflexes. It hovered on a cushion of anti-gravity energy, carrying a tray stacked with glasses filled with liquids that changed color with the shift of ambient light. The moment he reached toward one, the tray tilted slightly. Whether by accident or design, he couldn't tell, and the glass released a stream of liquid that arced toward him like a tiny comet. He flailed, catching it midair, but the sudden movement sent his sleeve smacking the tray, launching a second glass into a slow-motion collision with a hovering light orb. The orb wobbled, the light scattered into a kaleidoscope across the chamber, and he froze, anticipating disaster. Instead, the young woman laughed, the sound bright and melodic, and the tension broke like a popped bubble. He exhaled shakily, realizing that here, humor was not just allowed, it was practically mandatory. She stepped closer, her hands lightly brushing the shifting air as if to steady it, though the environment seemed to resist her touch with playful stubbornness. "I see you have flair," she said, tilting her head, the words more teasing than judgmental. The man nodded, unsure whether he should admit that he had no idea what he was doing, or if that might be considered insolence. He opted for a grim nod and an awkward smile, which made her laugh again, soft and warm, and he wondered if humans were supposed to be this endearing to aliens, or if he was simply lucky. The chamber stretched upward into what seemed like infinity, or perhaps it was merely a cleverly constructed illusion. Floating staircases spiraled in impossible arcs, disappearing into thin air and reappearing moments later. On each landing, statues of former rulers floated midair, some with multiple arms, some with translucent skin that allowed glimpses of internal light patterns that pulsed like slow heartbeats. Each figure seemed to regard him with the faintest trace of amusement, as though the entire history of the empire had been watching humans stumble through their halls for centuries and finally gotten a fresh specimen. He swallowed nervously and inched forward, catching the faintest glimmer of a grin on the young woman's lips. Then came the real test, a series of doors, each one projecting holographic images of various ceremonial rites. One door showed a formal greeting, where a human ambassador had apparently kissed a holographic statue by mistake, resulting in a minor scandal that had lasted decades. Another depicted a banquet where a guest had tried to sip floating soup and ended up entangled in the levitating tablecloth, eliciting uproarious laughter from those present. He stepped back instinctively, unsure if he was supposed to mimic these rituals or avoid them entirely. The young woman noticed and murmured something in a language that vibrated oddly in the air, her words weaving a pattern he could feel in his chest more than hear. Somehow he understood the gist. "You're fine, just keep being unpredictably human." At the far end of the hall, a large platform floated a few inches above the shifting floor, illuminated by a gentle halo of light. The young woman gestured toward it with a playful smirk. "Shall we see if you survive this next challenge?" she asked. He nodded, though his knees threatened mutiny. As he stepped onto the platform, the floor below him rippled violently, as if the palace itself were testing the limits of his balance. He wobbled, arms flailing, and narrowly avoided colliding with a projection of a colossal alien bird that blinked at him with curious, intelligent eyes. The platform shifted again, tilting gently at first, then with sudden jerks, each motion precise and calculated. The young woman floated beside him, her feet never touching the ground, and laughed, a sound that rang clear and pure above the mechanical hum of the palace. "You're remarkably clumsy," she said, grinning, "but that might just save you in the next hall." He couldn't help but laugh too, the tension cracking open as he realized he was actually enjoying this dangerous absurdity. Somewhere high above, a series of holographic screens flickered to life, showing alien citizens going about their daily lives. Floating gardens, vehicles propelled by light currents, citizens communicating via melodic hums that formed patterns in the air. A small robotic assistant zipped past, dropping a cluster of glowing crystals that bounced harmlessly off his shoulders. He sneezed in surprise, earning a delighted chuckle from the young woman. "Blessings of the Empire," she said lightly, and he found himself smiling, genuinely, feeling that for all its peril and strangeness, the place had a rhythm he could almost dance to. By the time he reached the end of the chamber, he was sweating, exhilarated, and slightly embarrassed at how little of it had gone according to any human plan. The young woman floated ahead, her red-tinged skin glowing warmly under the hovering lights, turning back just often enough to make sure he hadn't fallen completely behind. Her laughter, her teasing, her constant nudges toward survival were infectious. Somehow, in a hall of shifting floors, levitating objects, and surreal projections, he felt a flicker of belonging, a sense that in the absurdity of alien sophistication, his human clumsiness was not just tolerated, it was welcomed. At last, the chamber opened onto a balcony overlooking the sprawling alien city, towers bending and twisting with gravity-defying elegance, the streets alive with hovering vehicles and pedestrians gliding without touching the ground. He stepped onto the balcony, catching a breeze that smelled faintly of ozone and alien flowers, and the young woman floated to his side. She gestured expansively, a playful challenge in her eyes. "Welcome to the Empire," she said. "If you survive the introduction, The real fun begins. The man laughed, a little breathless, and for the first time, he thought that maybe surviving an alien court wasn't just a matter of skill. It was a matter of embracing chaos, enjoying it, and laughing when the universe tried to knock you off balance. Somewhere deep in the city, lights blinked like stars, reflections danced on every surface, and he knew, despite the unpredictability and danger, he had just taken the first step into something extraordinary. The hall was alive in a way that made his head spin, not with noise, but with motion. Gravity subtly shifted in unpredictable directions, and lights glimmered like liquid stars suspended in midair, tracing arcs and patterns that made him question whether he was moving forward or the palace itself was sliding beneath him. He tried to step carefully, but even his cautious movements caused ripples through the translucent floor, sending echoes of his presence scattering across holographic tapestries depicting alien history. Figures of former rulers shimmered into existence and vanished, their multiple eyes blinking in syncopated rhythm, as though they were judging his performance for some cosmic talent show. The young woman floated beside him, her red-tinted skin glowing faintly, silver hair drifting like a river of starlight. She tilted her head at him with that half-smile again, clearly amused, and muttered, "You humans really are spectacularly awkward." He attempted a dignified response, but tripped slightly over a wave in the floor. Somehow, he managed to recover, though the maneuver looked more like a slow-motion dance than anything noble. The young woman laughed, an unrestrained, melodic sound that rang across the hall and seemed to coax the environment itself into gentler undulations. "Well," she said, "you may not be graceful, but at least you're persistent." He swallowed, realizing that persistence might be the only survival skill that mattered in this place. Floating platforms drifted past, each carrying holographic projections of ceremonies he didn't understand. One showed an alien ambassador bowing to a statue of an extinct creature, only to have the statue retaliate with a polite but firm push, sending the ambassador tumbling across a zero-gravity fountain. The man blinked, unsure whether this was historical fact, a warning, or some elaborate prank. The young woman noticed his hesitation. "Don't worry," she said. "The fountains are mostly harmless, mostly." He laughed nervously, imagining himself being launched into the air for even the slightest faux pas. They reached a corridor where the walls were made entirely of iridescent panels that shifted color according to mood, or perhaps intention. Each panel displayed scenes from alien life. Gardens with trees that glowed softly, animals that seemed to float rather than walk, and citizens communicating with musical tones that formed visible arcs of light in the air. One panel caught his attention, a simulation of an alien court where a human visitor had spilled a tray of ceremonial liquids and caused the elder council to dance unintentionally. He suppressed a chuckle, glancing at the young woman. She was smirking, obviously remembering the story firsthand. A sudden gust of air brought a small swarm of floating creatures, jellyfish-like, each trailing thin filaments that sparked faintly. They circled around him, brushing against his shoulders and head, making him sneeze in surprise. The young woman waved her hand lightly, and the creatures parted respectfully, though one lingered to tap at his shoulder as if teasing him. "They like you," she said, grinning. "Or they find your confusion entertaining." He shook his head, muttering something about humans not being built for alien courts, and she laughed again, that sound threading warmth through the dizzying spectacle around him. At the center of the hall, a circular dais hovered slightly above the floor, glowing with a soft, golden light. The young woman gestured toward it with a teasing tilt of her head. "This is where most visitors realize just how fragile humans are." He hesitated. Fragile? He imagined falling into some gravity trap or tripping over floating tables. She laughed, almost singing the word. "It's mostly a formality. Or maybe a joke," she said, eyes sparkling with mischief. As he stepped onto the platform, the floor rippled beneath him like water caught in a gentle breeze, tilting unpredictably. He flailed, arms windmilling, narrowly avoiding collision with a hovering orb that projected alien constellations. Somehow, he managed to remain upright, his stumble more comical than disastrous. The young woman floated beside him, effortlessly adjusting her position to mirror his unsteady steps. "Remarkable," she said, "that you survived this without looking like a complete disaster." He laughed, partly in relief, partly in embarrassment, and she nodded approvingly. Holographic displays lit the room with faint whispers of alien history, showing councils, battles, and festivals. One in particular showed a human ambassador joining a royal banquet, only to accidentally sip a beverage that caused his hair to levitate in a shock of silvery strands. He grimaced, glancing at his own plain hair, silently hoping the palace wouldn't decide to play the same trick on him. The young woman noticed his reaction and whispered, "Don't worry, gravity here has a sense of humor, but it rarely targets visitors." He exhaled shakily, trying to find balance, and for a moment felt that chaotic exhilaration that comes from surviving against impossible odds. They continued through halls filled with floating gardens, plants suspended by anti-gravity fields, their leaves trailing light and energy. Tiny creatures darted among the branches, glowing faintly, some hovering near his shoulders as if curious about this strange human. He muttered a soft, "Hello," and one responded with a delicate hum, vibrating through the air and causing his knees to tremble involuntarily. The young woman laughed again, and he realized she found this absurdity just as entertaining as he did, though she moved through it with effortless grace. As they ascended a spiraling staircase that twisted upward into the air, he noticed subtle details of the princess's eyes, how they followed him with amusement, how her expression shifted slightly whenever he stumbled, how she seemed genuinely curious about his reactions. The staircase ended on a balcony that overlooked the Empire's sprawl. Towers twisted and bent as if painted by a living hand, streets hummed with floating vehicles, and citizens moved with a grace that made gravity seem optional. Hovering lights traced patterns across the sky, mimicking constellations of a world beyond his own, and the man felt a sudden thrill of possibility, as if he were witnessing the first glimpse of an entirely new cosmos. The young woman stepped beside him, pointing to a cluster of towers that seemed to float unsupported, connected by bridges that twisted like ribbons. "That's the council hall," she said, her tone both teasing and serious. "Most visitors never make it that far without being completely disoriented." He swallowed, trying to reconcile the humor of his previous missteps with the overwhelming grandeur before him. She smiled, a glint of challenge in her eyes. "I think you might just survive," she said, "or at least amuse everyone on the way." He laughed, breathless, feeling a mixture of fear, exhilaration, and the faintest spark of pride. Somehow, amidst the shifting gravity, floating platforms, and surreal displays, he realized that survival here might not just be about skill or cunning. It was about embracing the chaos, finding humor in the absurd, and maybe learning to trust this strange, luminous woman who had made him feel unexpectedly at home. As the balcony shimmered around them, he dared to imagine that this was only the beginning of something far larger, far more unpredictable, and far more extraordinary than he had ever anticipated. The hall was alive with soft, undulating light, hovering orbs drifting lazily above, casting reflections that danced across walls which shimmered like liquid crystal. The city beyond the palace windows glimmered in tiers of twisting towers and floating streets, each layer humming with energy that pulsed in time with the palace itself. He stepped forward cautiously, hands brushing the faint currents of anti-gravity that lifted petals, small luminous creatures, and stray scrolls into slow arcs. Somehow, after weeks, or had it been hours, the hall was alive with soft, undulating light, hovering orbs drifting lazily above, casting reflections that danced across walls which shimmered like liquid crystal. The city beyond the palace windows glimmered in tiers of twisting towers and floating streets, each layer humming with energy that pulsed in time with the palace itself. He stepped forward cautiously, hands brushing the faint currents of anti-gravity that lifted petals, small luminous creatures, and stray scrolls into slow arcs. Somehow, after weeks, or had it been hours, of surviving, stumbling, and occasionally thriving in this alien court, he no longer felt as though he was merely a visitor. He belonged, at least in some small, improbable way. The queen appeared at the far end of the hall, her silver hair catching the shifting light as if woven from starlight. Her elven ears peeked through the waves of hair, framing a face that was both imperious and playful. The princess hovered beside her mother, smirking in a way that made him wonder if she'd been observing him the entire time just for entertainment. "You've managed to arrive in one piece," the queen said, voice echoing gently. "Remarkably clumsy, yet oddly competent. Tell me, do you always survive chaos, or is this a new talent?" He swallowed, feeling the weight of all he had endured. The gravity tricks, the floating platforms, the bizarre etiquette, the laughing judgments of holographic elders, and realized he was no longer anxious in the same way. Humor, he now understood, was not merely a bridge to alien understanding. It was armor, a way to navigate unpredictability. "Mostly luck," he said, managing a crooked grin. "And maybe a little practice." The queen's eyes glimmered, as if she approved, and she gestured toward the center of the hall. The floor shifted beneath him in a deliberate ripple, raising a circular platform just high enough to catch the attention of the assembled court. The elders floated with quiet dignity, robes drifting like liquid, eyes a mixture of curiosity and restrained amusement. The young princess leaned on a hovering rail, whispering under her breath, though he caught the words. "Let's see if he finally understands protocol, or at least tries." He rolled his eyes, smiling. He had come far enough to know that in this empire, protocol was often a suggestion, not a rule. A sudden chime resonated through the hall, announcing the queen's declaration. Her hand lifted, and with a precision that sent a ripple through every light and surface in the room, she pointed directly at him. "My new husband," she said, the words echoing in a strange, melodic resonance that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Time slowed, or perhaps it was that the hall itself paused to witness the unprecedented moment. The floating orbs wavered midair, and for a heartbeat, he felt the entire weight of centuries of tradition pressing down, not on him, but around him, like invisible walls. He froze, unsure if he was supposed to respond with words, a bow, or some alien gesture he hadn't yet learned. The princess's eyes sparkled with amusement and challenge, silently daring him to do something unpredictable. He blinked, then allowed a crooked, human smile to form, a small act of defiance and acceptance all at once. I suppose I accept," he said, voice trembling slightly, though not from fear. Laughter rippled through the hall, subtle and controlled, breaking the tension just enough to allow the absurdity of the moment to settle into reality. The elders murmured among themselves, their whispers translating into shifting light patterns along the walls. Some were skeptical, others quietly impressed, and a few even laughed softly, the sound carrying like wind through the tall chamber. For all the rigid tradition of the court, the human's unpredictability had carved a new place for him, a place earned not through ceremony alone, but through humor, courage, and a willingness to embrace the strange with open hands. The queen descended from her elevated platform, her movements graceful but imbued with strength. She reached him with a hand extended, and he hesitated for only a moment before taking it, feeling the warmth of her skin, the pulse of authority, and the strange reassurance of connection. The princess drifted closer, her expression now softened, her amusement replaced by curiosity and quiet approval. For the first time, he understood that the bonds formed in this empire were built not just on obedience or protocol, but on trust, shared experience, and a willingness to embrace the unexpected. A small commotion erupted as a hovering tray, still carrying its ever-shifting liquids, tried to pass between the attendants and failed spectacularly, sending a spray of iridescent liquid across a holographic tapestry. He stepped back reflexively, expecting disaster, but the queen simply laughed, a sound that seemed to stitch the room together. "It seems even the palace celebrates your arrival," she said. "Chaos and charm suit you well." He realized then how much he had changed. At the beginning, he had been a human entirely out of place, terrified by alien sophistication, uncertain whether he could navigate a world so different from his own. Now he moved with cautious confidence, understanding that humor, humility, and adaptability were as potent as skill or protocol. He had survived challenges that would have broken him before, and in the process had become something more. A bridge between species, a human who could exist in an empire that seemed impossible. The princess stepped closer, offering a hand in silent camaraderie. He took it, the gesture simple yet profound, a signal that the world of the court, with all its absurdity and grandeur, was now open to him. The queen, her eyes glimmering with satisfaction and amusement, gestured to the floating orbs, the gardens, the city beyond, and the endless expanse of the palace itself. "Welcome," she said, "not just as a guest but as part of us." The man breathed in, the sense of alien flora and ozone filling his senses, the light of the hovering orbs bathing him in warm, shifting color. He laughed softly, genuinely, and felt the palace respond. Lights glimmered brighter, floating petals drifted in gentle arcs, and the whispers of history and tradition seemed to nod in acknowledgement. In that moment, he understood the extraordinary truth of his journey, not merely survival, but transformation. He was no longer just human. He was someone capable of navigating, understanding, and even thriving within an empire that defied imagination. As the hall settled into calm activity, with floating lights tracing serene patterns and elders observing quietly, he felt a rare sense of completion. The absurdities, the chaos, the laughter, and the unexpected moments of grace had all led here, to a place where he belonged. He glanced at the queen, then the princess, and allowed himself a private smile. The court had frozen to witness the impossible, and he had stepped forward, alive, unbroken, and against all odds at home. The palace, as if acknowledging his journey, shimmered and pulsed around him, a living monument to a reality he had once thought incomprehensible. He took a deep breath and allowed the laughter, light, and motion to wash over him. The human who had stumbled into an alien empire was no longer merely a visitor. He was a presence, a participant, and perhaps, in some small but significant way, a part of its story forever.